Cora Whitlock had learned to measure the exact weight of a polite rejection, and after carrying her rare and gifted hands from one prestigious restoration workshop to the next, from one antique auction house to another, all in a single day, she bore that weight through Penn Station near midnight, clutching her father's walnut tool chest tightly against her breast. $200 was all she had left in her pocket, and only the final northbound train of the night stood between her and the small attic above the clock shop, where she would have to return carrying a failure she didn't yet know how to confess to Grandma Nell. As she folded herself into the window seat of the nearly empty train car, she had no idea that the silent stranger in the muted three-piece suit settling beside her was a man who could alter the entire course of a person's life with a single phone call. She knew only that she was too exhausted to speak, too hollowed out to notice when her head tilted to one side and came to rest against his shoulder as the train raced past the dark forests along the New England coast. And so she never felt the thin envelope slipping from the inside pocket of her father's old work jacket. She didn't see the 3 pages slide free and fall into the narrow gap between their seats. A professional resume, a faded photograph of the grandfather clock her father had crafted with his own hands, and a letter no stranger was ever meant to read, bearing a title written in a trembling hand that said these were 12 reasons not to give up. When the man leaned down to gather the fallen pages, he intended only to straighten them and quietly place them in her lap. He didn't mean to read the first line, but those words held him the way truth always holds someone when it touches the most deeply hidden place within them, because Cora's simple words had awakened something he thought he had buried long ago, before the sound of his name had become powerful enough to silence the entire city of Providence. What he decided to do next, aboard a night train rushing through the darkness, beside a sleeping woman who still didn't know his name, is the reason this story became one worth remembering. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to support us, and enjoy the story. Near midnight, the platform at Penn Station in New York lay submerged in the weary yellow glow of lights that had been burning too long through a day that had already stretched on far too long. Amid the sparse stream of passengers trudging toward the final northbound train, Cora Whitlock walked slowly, clutching her father's walnut tool chest against her breast, as though it were the only thing still anchoring her to the earth. She had no idea that at the far end of the platform, leaning against a cold steel pillar, a stranger in a dark coat was silently watching her every step. His eyes never left her when she handed her ticket to the conductor, and they never left her when she disappeared into the train car. He merely tilted his head slightly, as if committing something to memory, before taking out his phone and vanishing into the darkness of the tunnel, a shadow Cora would never have imagined on a night when she believed her greatest misfortune was simply that she had failed. All that day, she had gone from one prestigious restoration workshop to another, from one antique auction house to the next, knocking on doors across the vast city while carrying with her the hands her father had once said could hear the heartbeat of any mechanism. Yet all she had received in return were courteous shakes of the head and the same phrases repeated until they had worn her heart thin. She was talented, they told her. Her hands possessed a rare gift, but they needed a name, a diploma from some distinguished academy, something a young woman who had taught herself the trade in a small clock shop in the textile town of Pawtucket could never hope to possess. And so she dragged her exhausted body onto the last night train home, with exactly $200 left in her pocket, and a weariness so heavy that it seemed to press upon her shoulders like a soaked blanket. She found a seat beside the window in a nearly empty car, where only a handful of passengers sat, with their heads bowed in sleep beneath the pale blue lights. When the train shuddered out of the station and rolled into the dense darkness stretching along the New England coast, Cora rested her forehead against the icy glass and watched the city lights blur into long streaks before fading away. She thought of the little attic above the clock shop waiting for her at home. She thought of Grandma Nell, who would ask how the trip had gone with eyes so full of hope that Cora couldn't bear to extinguish it. She thought of every door that had closed in her face, one after another, until the warmth of the train car and the steady grinding of steel wheels against the rails lulled her into an exhaustion she no longer had the strength to resist. Her eyelids sank shut, the tool chest loosened in her slackening arms, and after 3 nights with almost no sleep, her body gently tilted toward the man seated beside her. He was a tall man in a custom-tailored 3-piece suit in muted tones, a man whose face she hadn't even taken the time to study. He had sat there in silence from the moment he boarded, one hand absently turning a worn old coin over and over, his stone-gray eyes fixed upon the darkness beyond the window with the brooding stillness of someone carrying burdens no one else was permitted to see. When Cora's head came to rest against his shoulder, his body tensed for a fleeting moment, the instinctive reaction of a man who had spent his entire life on guard. Then he relaxed when he realized that it was only a young woman sleeping so deeply that she had no idea what she was doing, a woman whose face bore every mark of exhaustion and yet retained a strange serenity, as though even in sleep she were still clinging to something sacred. He couldn't bring himself to wake her. He remained perfectly still as the train sped past black forests and sleeping towns, until it swept into a sharp curve and lurched over a rough section of track. The entire car rattled violently, and in that sudden jolt, a thin envelope slipped from the inside pocket of her father's worn canvas work jacket, the jacket she always wore as a way of keeping him close. 3 pages slid from the open envelope and slipped into the narrow space between the 2 seats, coming to rest beside the gleaming toe of the man's polished shoe. The first page was a carefully typed resume bearing the name Cora Whitlock and describing the years she had spent learning the restoration of antique clocks beside her father. The second was a faded photograph of a magnificent oak grandfather clock that her father had crafted with his own hands many years before. The third page, its folds worn soft from having been opened and closed too many times, was a handwritten letter in slightly smudged ink, with a carefully penned title at the top that read, 12 Reasons Not to Give Up. The man had noticed the white pages the instant they fell into his line of sight. With the caution of someone who didn't want to disturb a stranger's rare moment of rest, he leaned down and gathered all 3 sheets between his long fingers, intending only to straighten them, fold them neatly, and place them silently in her lap without reading a single word. In the world where he had spent his entire life, a person's privacy was the last remaining thing worthy of respect. But as he lifted the pages to eye level to align their edges, the pale blue light overhead fell directly across the first line of the handwritten letter. The words were simple, yet so honest that they caught and held his gaze, bringing his moving fingers to an abrupt stillness in midair. His breathing slowed for a single beat, and the man whose name could silence the entire city of Providence whenever it was spoken, the man who had believed himself hardened against everything this world could inflict, suddenly found himself unable to look away from the trembling handwriting of a woman whose name he didn't yet know, as though that single line had awakened something he had buried deep within himself a very long time ago. The first reason on that worn and folded page told of a father who had sold the set of watchmaking tools that had passed down through 3 generations of his family, tools he loved more than almost anything he owned, so that his daughter could afford her first true year of learning the craft. And something deep inside Lorenzo Barone went utterly still as his eyes moved down the trembling ink. Because he had not meant to read a single word and yet now he could not stop. The third reason, speaking of how every year when the holidays came and the family gathered, she would look at the empty chair where her father used to sit and silently promise him that she would never let discouragement be the thing that finally broke her. And the 7th reason, confessing in a smaller and more fragile hand that if she gave up now, the little girl who had once sat for hours on a wooden stool in a dim workshop learning to listen for the faint and secret heartbeat inside a dying machine would never forgive the woman she had become. And with each line the noise of the train seemed to fall away from Lorenzo until there was nothing left in the whole dim carriage but the sound of his own slow breathing and the terrible familiarity of the words in his hands. For 15 years ago, when he was still young, and the world he had been born into had just taken from him everything he had sat alone in the back room of a house that smelled of candle smoke and grief, and had written a list almost exactly like this one, not on fine paper, but on the back of the small memorial card printed for his mother's funeral, a card he still carried to this very day, folded inside his wallet, because it was the only thing in his life he had never once been willing to lose. And the strangeness of the moment pressed down on him like a hand upon his chest, that here in the last carriage of a midnight train, he should be holding the private confession of a woman he had never met, and finding in it the shape of his own buried heart. For he understood without needing to be told that this sleeping stranger was a person who lived by the relics of her dead, the same way he lived by the relics of his own. That the worn wooden box she still held even in sleep was not a box of tools but a way of keeping a father beside her, just as a folded funeral card was his way of keeping a mother. And Lorenzo Barone, a man who had spent his entire life learning to feel nothing so that he might survive, sat there and felt something move in him that he had believed long dead, and very carefully, with the same steady hands that the world feared for entirely different reasons, he squared the 3 pages back into their original order, the resume first, and the photograph of the beautiful oak clock second, and the letter of 12 reasons last, exactly as they had been, and he leaned across the small space between them and slipped the thin envelope back into the inner pocket of the worn canvas coat she wore, moving so slowly and so gently that she did not stir, her head still resting against his shoulder, and her face still holding that strange and stubborn peace. And as the train carried them both northward through the sleeping dark, he turned his gaze back to the black window, and to his own faint reflection in it, and made a quiet decision. The kind of decision that in his world was more binding than any contract signed in ink, that whoever this woman was, and whatever door the world had just slammed in her face, he was going to find a way to open one for her, though he did not yet have the faintest idea how, and he told himself it was only a debt of recognition being repaid from one survivor to another, and he almost believed it. For nearly an hour Lorenzo did not move, unwilling to steal from her even a single minute of the rest she so plainly needed, and when at last the conductor's voice drifted down the carriage announcing that Providence was near, and the train began to slow, Cora Whitlock woke all at once with the disoriented panic of someone surfacing from a sleep far deeper than she had intended. And in the first blurred second she understood 2 things together, that her cheek was resting against the warm shoulder of a complete stranger, and that she had no memory whatsoever of having let it happen, and she pulled away so fast that she nearly dropped the wooden box, a hot flood of embarrassment rising up her throat and into her face as she began to stammer an apology, brushing at his sleeve as if she might have creased the expensive fabric, saying she was so sorry, that she had not slept in days, that she never did things like this, and Lorenzo watched her with a calm that only deepened her fluster, and told her quietly that there was nothing at all to apologize for, but there was something careful in the way he was looking at her, something weighed and deliberate. And after a moment he drew a slow breath and told her the truth in the plainest words he could find, that when the train had jolted at the bend her papers had fallen from her coat, and that he had gathered them, and that before he had thought to stop himself he had read her letter, and the warmth drained out of Cora's face, and was replaced by something cold and rigid, her fingers closing hard around the box in her lap until the knuckles went white, and she said in a low and shaking voice that he had no right at all to read something that private, and he did not flinch, and he did not defend himself. He only said quietly that she was completely right to be angry, and that he would not blame her for a single word of it, but that he was asking her, before she decided what kind of man he was, to let him tell her a story, and there was something in the low and even weight of his voice, something that did not sound like a powerful man used to being obeyed, but like a tired one who rarely spoke at all, that made her stay still and listen. And so as the lights of Providence began to gather in the fog beyond the window he told her, in a restrained and measured voice stripped of any bid for pity, about a narrow, crowded neighborhood called Federal Hill, where he had grown up in the shadow of things no child should stand near, about a mother named Serafina who had been the only softness in his entire world, and who had died when he was 12 years old, about a father who had never once said he loved him, but who, before the boy had even finished grieving, had pulled him by the collar into what the family only ever called the business, telling him that softness was a luxury their kind of people could not afford to keep. And Cora, who had boarded this train believing she was the most defeated person on it, found her anger slowly loosening into something far more confusing as she listened to this composed and elegant man describe a childhood that had been every bit as starved of gentleness as her own. And he told her about the night after the funeral, when he was still small enough to believe grief could kill a person, how he had taken the little memorial card printed with his mother's name and turned it over, and written on the back of it every reason he could think of to keep breathing until morning, 10 of them in all, and how he still carried that card folded in his wallet 15 years later, because it was the truest thing he had ever written and the only thing that had ever kept him honest. And then he said the thing he had never said aloud to anyone in his life, not to the men who feared him, and not to the few who claimed to be close to him, that he had never chosen the life he lived, that he had only survived inside it. And that reading her 12 reasons had felt exactly like looking into a mirror he had spent years learning not to glance at. And Cora sat very still under the pale carriage light, the box no longer clutched like a shield but simply held, because she could not find in his face any of the calculation she had braced herself for, only the plain and weary sincerity of a person who genuinely remembered what the bottom of things felt like. And when the train sighed to a halt against the platform, and the doors slid open onto a cold and fog-wrapped Providence night, he reached into his coat and drew out a single heavy card and set it in her hand, and told her that if she ever wanted it, he knew of one place in this city that would understand what her hands could do, a house of restoration called Ferraro Atelier, and that a word from him could open its door. And Cora looked down at the card, and then back at him, and thanked him in a guarded voice. Because a lifetime of hard lessons had taught her that kindness which arrived too easily almost always carried a price she would be asked to pay later, and she stepped down onto the platform into the mist, without promising him anything at all, and she did not look back to see him watching her go. The last bus out to Pawtucket rattled through streets slick with fog, and rolled past the shuttered brick mills that had given the town its life a century ago, and taken it away again, and Cora leaned her head against the cold glass, and turned the heavy card over and over in her fingers, without deciding anything, until she reached her own street, and walked the final 3 blocks with the wooden box under her arm, and saw, glowing warm and low in the window of the little shop on the corner, the amber lamp that her grandmother always left burning for her, no matter how late the hour, and above the window, the old hand-painted sign that read, "Whitlock Clockworks," in letters her father had lettered himself. And when she pushed open the door, the familiar chorus met her at once, the soft and uneven ticking of dozens of half-repaired clocks, all keeping slightly different time, a sound that to anyone else might have seemed like disorder, but that to Cora had always been the sound of home, the sound of her whole childhood. And there in the back room under a single lamp sat Eleanor Whitlock, 79 years old, wrapped in a knitted shawl with a mug of tea gone cold at her elbow, waiting up as she always did, and the old woman rose slowly on stiff and aching joints, and crossed the room, and folded her granddaughter into her arms, without asking a single hard question. Not how the trip had gone, not what the city had said, only holding her. And Cora felt the whole tight knot of the last 2 weeks come loose in her chest, and she pressed her face into her grandmother's shoulder, and let herself be held in the warm room full of ticking, and Nell stroked her hair, and murmured that everything always looked different once the morning came, and for a little while the two of them simply stood there among the clocks. And then there was a soft knock at the side door, and it was Dottie Alvarez from the row house next door, 68 years old, and never one to sleep before 2 in the morning, carrying a covered pot of the lentil soup she made, whenever she sensed one of her neighbors was carrying something heavy, and she set it on the workbench and clucked over how thin Cora was getting, and how the city was no place for a girl who could hear the heart of a clock. And the ordinary warmth of the two old women moving about the little kitchen, ladling soup and scolding gently and laughing at nothing, pushed the cold of the platform, and the fog and the strange man on the train a long way off, so that for a handful of minutes, Cora almost believed she had come home to nothing worse than a disappointment. But when Dottie had gone, and Nell had finally been persuaded up the narrow stairs to bed, Cora went to lock the front door for the night, and found, taped to the inside of the glass where her grandmother would surely not have thought to look, a plain envelope the color of pale butter, and she knew what it was before she opened it, because she had already received 2 others just like it, and had told no one. And inside, on stiff official paper, was a final notice with a date printed in bold at the bottom, a date that gave her exactly 7 days, and Cora stood there in the dark shop, with the paper in her hand, and the clocks ticking their crooked chorus all around her, and felt the fear come up in her like cold water, and very quietly, so that not even the stairs would carry the sound up to the old woman sleeping above. She folded the notice small, and pushed it deep into her pocket, where it would stay hidden, because more than she feared losing the shop, she feared her grandmother knowing how close they were to losing it. And she crossed the dark room to the tall workbench in the corner, where the last thing her father had ever touched still stood beneath a soft cloth. A magnificent long-case clock of oak and brass that Thomas Whitlock had been building by hand in his final year, and had not lived to finish, its movement still open and silent, its pendulum hanging motionless, and she drew back the cloth and laid her fingertips against the cold metal the way he had taught her. And she remembered him sitting on his stool with his cancer-thin hands guiding her small ones, telling her that a clock was only a heart made of brass, and that every heart, no matter how still it had gone, remembered how to beat if only someone was patient enough to listen. And she remembered the promise she had made to herself at his bedside, and had carried like a stone in her chest ever since. That she would keep this shop alive and this last clock beating for as long as her grandmother drew breath, so that Nell would never have to see the one thing her son had left behind go dark. And standing there in the ticking dark with 7 days folded in her pocket, Cora did not yet know how she would keep that promise. She only knew that she would rather break every bone in her hands than break it. Morning came gray and salt-scented off the bay, and Cora did not sleep so much as lie awake turning the heavy card over in her fingers until the first pale light reached the attic window, and by the time the town began to stir, she had made up her mind that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, and so she took the bus into Providence, and stood at last before Ferraro Atelier. And it was not at all what she had imagined. Not a shop, but a converted riverfront warehouse of old brick and tall arched windows, where the morning light fell in long golden bars across workbenches, strewn with the disassembled hearts of 100 beautiful and broken things, gilded mirrors and marble mantel clocks, and inlaid music boxes, and the carved faces of saints from some demolished chapel. The moment Cora stepped inside and breathed in the familiar smell of beeswax and brass polish and old wood, she felt something in her chest ease, because whatever else this place was, it was a temple built by people who loved the same things she loved, and a young woman at the front desk led her upstairs to a bright office where Gia Ferraro rose to meet her, a woman of 33, with dark hair pinned back, and the sharp appraising eyes of someone who had spent her life judging the true worth of things beneath their surfaces, and for the first quarter of an hour, it went better than anything Cora had dared to hope. For when Gia set before her the movement of a stubborn astronomical clock that her own people had struggled with, Cora bent over it and listened, and after a moment spoke of the fault so precisely and with such quiet certainty that Gia fell silent, and then leaned forward with real astonishment in her face, saying that she had watched trained masters take twice as long to hear what this girl from a mill town had heard in a matter of minutes, and Cora felt for the first time in weeks the warm and dangerous stirring of hope. felt a door beginning to swing open at last. And then Gia, still smiling, still warm, asked the simplest and most natural question in the world. She asked how a restorer working out of a small shop in Pawtucket had come to know of the atelier at all, who had sent her, and Cora, wanting to be nothing but honest, told her the truth, that she had met a man on the train 2 nights before. A man named Lorenzo Barone who had given her a card and said this was a place worthy of her hands, and the change that came over Gia Ferraro's face was like watching a window frost over from the inside, the warmth vanishing degree by degree until what remained was smooth and cold and unreadable, and she sat back very slowly and closed the leather notebook on her desk with a soft and final click. And she looked at Cora for a long moment before she spoke, and when she did speak, her voice was perfectly level and all the more cutting for it, telling Cora that her work was, without question, exceptional, that she had rarely seen a truer ear for the craft, and that none of it changed anything, because she would not take on a single soul who arrived through the recommendation of Lorenzo Barone. And when Cora, bewildered, began to ask why, Gia told her plainly, the thing that Lorenzo had chosen not to, that 3 years ago she had been engaged to marry him, that she had been 1 week from wearing the dress when he had called it off without a word of true explanation, and walked out of her life as coldly as if she had been a bad investment, and that she had promised herself she would never again let that man place anything or anyone into her house, as though he still had the right. And Cora sat frozen in the chair, with the astronomical clock ticking its slow, indifferent rhythm between them, and understood that the golden door she had let herself believe in for 15 minutes had just been shut in her face, over a wound that had nothing to do with her and that she could not possibly have known about. And Gia rose and came around the desk, and though her voice softened a fraction, there was steel beneath it still, telling Cora that if her talent was as real as it seemed, then she owed it to herself to walk in through her own door on her own name, and not to spend her life standing inside the long shadow of a man like that. And then she showed her out with a courtesy more final than any slammed door. And Cora walked back down through the golden warehouse full of beautiful broken things, and out into a cold rain that had begun to fall along the river. And she stood on the wet cobblestones with the hood of her father's canvas coat pulled up, and the rain running down her face, and felt the bitter and familiar taste of a chance destroyed by a history she had never been given the chance to know. And somewhere beneath the anger and the despair, a small and stubborn ember refused to go out. Across the city that same gray afternoon, in a quiet upstairs room above a shuttered social club on Federal Hill, where the only sound was the faint tick of the very card he carried against his own restlessness, Lorenzo Barone could not put the woman from the train out of his mind, and because he was a man who had never in his life known how to sit still with a feeling, he did the only thing he knew how to do with it. He turned it into a question to be answered, and he called for Tommy Greco, the one man in the whole organization he trusted without reservation, 46 years old, and gray at the temples and loyal in the bone, and he told him only that there was a clockmaker in Pawtucket named Cora Whitlock, and that he wanted to understand quietly why a woman with hands like that should be so completely at the end of her rope. And he told himself that this was simple due diligence and nothing more, that a careful man learned everything before he opened a door for anyone, and Tommy, who had known Lorenzo since he was a hard-eyed boy and could read him better than Lorenzo liked, said nothing and went to find out. And it took him less than a day, and when he came back into the quiet room that evening, he did not sit down, which was the first thing Lorenzo noticed. And the second thing he noticed was the careful and reluctant way Tommy spoke, and what Tommy laid out for him in that low, even voice made something cold begin to crawl up the length of Lorenzo Barone's spine. Because it was so much worse than a run of bad luck, it was a trap that had been quietly closing for 2 years. For Tommy told him that when the girl's father, a clockmaker named Thomas Whitlock, had been dying of a long and expensive illness 2 years ago, and the medical bills had risen higher than the little shop could ever hope to answer, Cora had done the thing that frightened and desperate people with no other door left to knock on so often do. She had walked into a storefront lender on a hard street in Pawtucket and signed a short-term loan at a punishing rate of interest to pay the last of her father's care and to keep the shop from being taken, and she had put up the deed to the building itself, the shop and the home above it, and everything her family had, as the collateral against it. And she had told no one, not a friend, not a neighbor, not even the grandmother who slept above her every night, because the shame of how close she had come to losing her father's life work was a weight she had decided to carry entirely alone, and Lorenzo had listened to worse things in his life without moving a muscle. But then Tommy said the name of the lender, a man named Ray Petrocelli, who ran a place called Coastline Financial, and the room went very still, because Lorenzo knew that name and knew that storefront for exactly what it was. Not a lender at all, but a laundry. A quiet and profitable front through which the Falcone family, the oldest and most patient enemies his own family had, washed their money clean. Which meant that the deed to everything Cora Whitlock loved in this world had been sitting for 2 years in the hands of the very people who would have given a great deal to find a blade to hold against the throat of the House of Barone. And Tommy told him the rest in the same reluctant voice, that the loan had been written with a single enormous final payment due, all at once at the end of its term. The kind of payment that a girl scraping by on the repair of mantel clocks could never in her life produce, and that the term was very nearly up, that by the count of it she had something like 7 days left before Coastline Financial could lawfully take the deed, and the shop and the home, and the last unfinished clock her father had ever touched, and turn a woman and her 79-year-old grandmother out onto the street. And Lorenzo stood at the dark window with the lights of Providence smeared by rain below him, and understood in that moment the full and terrible shape of what he had done without meaning to. Because a man like him did not ask after a woman quietly. Not really. The streets had 100 ears and every one of them was for sale. And his own visit to Ferraro Atelier, to speak a word on behalf of a clockmaker from Pawtucket, had almost certainly already traveled, passed hand to hand and whisper to whisper until it reached the wrong ear, and the Falcones, who for years had searched in vain for a single soft place in a man who had none, were about to learn that Lorenzo Barone had suddenly and inexplicably taken an interest in the very woman whose entire life they already held in their hands. And he saw with awful clarity that the small mercy he had meant to offer a stranger on a train had instead just painted a target on her back and placed it directly in the path of the deadliest enemies he had. And for the first time in a very long time, Lorenzo Barone, who was feared across an entire city, felt something that he had almost forgotten how to feel, and it was fear, though not for himself. Cora did not sleep the night after the rain and the closed door, but somewhere in the long gray hours before dawn, her despair had quietly hardened into something with an edge to it, because when she had come home soaked to the skin and told her grandmother in a flat and beaten voice that the finest restoration house in New England had turned her away over a man she had met for 2 hours on a train, Eleanor Whitlock had listened with her worn hands folded on the kitchen table and her eyes that had watched 79 years of the world take and take. And then the old woman had said the thing that would not leave Cora's head for the rest of that sleepless night. That sometimes when a door is shut in your face, you cannot stand in the road and wait for a man to come and open it for you. Not even a kind one, not even a powerful one, because a door opened by someone else can be closed by someone else. And that if the girl truly had the gift her father had spent his life pouring into her hands, then she would have to find a way to break that door down herself and walk through it on her own name, and the words settled into Cora like a coal that would not cool. And in the morning she did not open the job listings, and she did not answer the card burning a hole in her coat. Instead, she made 3 telephone calls to people who still remembered her father's name, in the small tight world of people who mend old things. And by the second afternoon, she had learned the one thing she needed, that Ferraro Atelier was quietly drowning in a private humiliation. For a great museum had sent them the crown of a fallen collection, an astronomical clock built in the 1700s by a master long turned to dust, a machine of moon phases and star wheels, and a mechanism so intricate and so damaged that the atelier's own finest hands had labored over it for months, and had at last written the museum a letter admitting the thing could not be saved. And Cora, who had nothing left to lose but the one thing no one could take from her, sat down and wrote Gia Ferraro a short and steady letter offering to attempt it with no name attached to the work, and no fee asked, and no credit claimed, only a chance to prove in the one language that could not lie that a clock declared dead was not always dead. And something in the sheer audacity of it, or perhaps the pressure of a museum's patience running out, made Gia agree to a blind trial. And so for 3 nights running, Cora sat alone in a corner of that golden warehouse with the great wounded machine open before her under a single lamp, and she did the thing her father had taught her when she was a child, too small to reach the bench. She stopped trying to force it, and she simply listened, laid her fingertips to the cold escapement, and closed her eyes, and waited for the machine to tell her where its heart had gone still. And hour by hour through those 3 long nights, the buried thing in her, that a lifetime of scraping merely to survive had nearly silenced, came awake and began to sing. The gift she had almost let the world convince her was worthless answering at last. And near dawn on the 3rd night, with her eyes burning and her hands trembling from exhaustion, Cora set the final wheel true and held her breath and gave the pendulum the smallest push, and the clock that the masters had pronounced beyond all saving drew a long, slow breath of brass and began, after more than 2 centuries of silence, to keep the time of the stars once more, and she sat back in the empty golden room and wept, not for grief this time, but because she had proven to the only judge that mattered, which was herself, that her father had been right about her hands. While Cora fought her private battle in the corner of a warehouse she had been forbidden to work in, Lorenzo Barone was fighting a quieter one with himself, for he had told no one what he had learned from Tommy, and he had not gone to her with it, because he understood that a woman like Cora Whitlock would sooner die than be told by a powerful stranger that he had gone digging into the most shameful secret of her life. And yet he could not simply do nothing while the days ran out, and so he did the only thing he could think of that would let him stay near her honestly, without ever revealing what he already knew. He took from the locked cabinet in his study the one object in all the world that he had never once let another human being touch, a small mantel clock of dark wood and tarnished silver that had belonged to his mother Serafina, a clock that had stopped at some hour in the night 22 years ago and had never moved again, its hands frozen at the exact minute of her passing. And he had kept it all those years without ever winding it, because he had never been able to decide whether starting it again would be a healing or a betrayal, and he carried it wrapped in a cloth into the little shop in Pawtucket, where the crooked chorus of 100 clocks met him at the door. And when Cora looked up from her bench with wary and reddened eyes, he did not explain. He only unwrapped the small dead clock and set it down on the wood in front of her, and said in a low voice that he had heard she could hear things other people could not, and that he wondered if she would look at this one. And Cora, who did not know and could not have guessed what this quiet object was to the man standing before her, drew it toward her and opened the back of the case and bent her head to it the way she bent her head to everything, listening. And Lorenzo stood very still on the other side of the bench and watched her hands move over the thing that held the last minute of his mother's life, the way another man might watch a surgeon touch his own heart, and neither of them spoke for a long while. And then Cora looked up and asked him a small and ordinary question, the kind of question she asked every owner of every broken clock, whether he wanted her to leave the hands set at the hour it had stopped, the way some people wish to keep a clock as a memorial to a moment, or whether he wanted her to set it right and let it run again. And the question, so plain and so gentle, landed in Lorenzo Barone like a blade slipped between the ribs, because it was not really a question about a clock at all. It was the question he had been unable to answer for 22 years, whether he had the courage to let the thing he had lost keep living instead of freezing it forever at the moment of the loss. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the man whose stillness had frightened an entire city could not find his voice. His jaw worked, and his eyes went bright, and he had to look away toward the fogged window before he could master himself. And Cora, watching, understood all at once, and without a single word being said, whose clock this was, and what it meant. Understood it the way only a person who slept above a shop full of a dead father's unfinished work could understand it. And something passed between the two of them in that ticking room that neither of them had the words for. Two people who had each spent years keeping a dead parent close by, refusing to let go of a broken thing, and very softly, so as not to shame him, Cora said that he did not have to decide tonight. That she would clean it, and mend the movement, and leave the choice of whether it should run to him, and Lorenzo nodded without trusting himself to speak, and in the warm, crooked music of that little shop, the hardest man in Providence, and the girl he had meant only to help, stood on either side of his mother's silent clock, and were, for one unguarded moment, exactly the same. In the days that followed the night of his mother's clock, Lorenzo Barone found reasons to come back to the little shop in Pawtucket, and Cora, though she told herself she was only being courteous to a paying client, found that she did not mind, for he would arrive in the late afternoon, when the light came slanting gold through the dusty front window, and he would fold his tall frame into the worn chair in the corner, and simply sit there while she worked, saying little, watching her hands, and there was something in the way the most feared man in Providence let the crooked chorus of 100 ticking clocks wash over him that told her he had not known a room this peaceful in a very long time, and slowly, without either of them naming it, a rhythm formed between them, and he began to learn the shop the way a person learns a face they have come to love. Learning that the tall clock by the door ran 2 minutes fast no matter what she did, and that Cora had stopped fighting it and simply called it stubborn, learning that the little carriage clock on the second shelf had been her father's favorite and was never for sale at any price, learning the names she had given to machines that had no business having names. And one evening she looked up from her bench to find that the loose board on the third stair that had tripped her grandmother for a year had been quietly fixed while her back was turned, the nails set flush and sanded smooth, and he said nothing about it, and neither did she, but she understood that this was how a man who had never once in his life been able to say a tender word out loud had learned instead to speak in the language of small repairs. And something in her that had been braced hard against him for weeks let go a little more, because a lifetime of hard lessons had taught her to distrust kindness that announced itself. And here was a kindness that did the opposite, that hid, that asked for nothing and waited to be noticed or not. And that was a kind she had never learned to guard against. And it was during those same quiet days that Lorenzo first truly met Eleanor Whitlock, for the old woman came shuffling out from the back parlor one afternoon in her knitted shawl and looked the dangerous stranger up and down with eyes that had weighed 79 years of men and were not the least bit afraid of this one. And to Cora's astonishment, the man who could silence a room with a glance went almost shy before her grandmother, rising to his feet and taking the old woman's small hand in both of his, with a gentleness that looked almost clumsy on him, answering her sharp questions with a quiet deference he showed no one else in the world. And Nell, who had buried a husband and a son and had long since lost the habit of being fooled by anyone, studied the way he watched her granddaughter across the room and seemed to make up her mind about a great many things all at once, and she said only that he was welcome to stay for supper if he could stomach Dottie's cooking, which from Eleanor Whitlock was very nearly a benediction, and later, after Lorenzo had gone back out into the dark toward whatever life waited for him on Federal Hill, the old woman sat with Cora by the low fire and was quiet for a long while before she spoke, and when she did speak her voice had lost its sharpness and held instead the plain and unhurried honesty of a person who has stopped having the luxury of time to waste on anything but the truth. And she told Cora that she could feel her own clock winding down now, that she was not afraid of it, that she had made her peace with the fact that she would not see very many more winters come in off the bay. And Cora started to protest, the way the young always do, but her grandmother, lifted one thin hand and stopped her, and said no, that they would not pretend. Not the two of them, not after everything, and that there was only one thing left in this world that frightened her, and it was not dying. It was the thought of closing her eyes for the last time and leaving this earth knowing that her granddaughter was still standing in that shop carrying the whole crushing weight of it entirely alone. Still believing that the only love she was allowed to keep was the kind she could earn with her hands, and never the kind that was simply given. And then Nell said the thing that would not leave Cora for the rest of her life. That she had watched her own son, Cora's father, put off his own happiness again and again, with the word later, later when the debts were paid, later when the shop was steady, later when there was finally time, until one gray morning the doctors told him there would be no later at all, and that she had promised herself she would not stand by and watch the same bargain steal the same years from his daughter. And she looked at Cora with her tired and loving eyes, and told her softly that a heart is exactly like one of those clocks on the wall. That it does not do a single soul any good sitting stopped and safe on a shelf, waiting for a better time to start. That it is only worth anything at all when it is allowed to run, and that if there was a person in this world who made her granddaughter's guarded heart want to run again, then Cora must not do what her father had done. Must not tell herself there would be time to let herself be loved once everything else was finally in order. Because the cruelest lie the world ever tells, the good and the dutiful, is the lie that there will always be a later. And Cora sat there in the firelight, with the whole ticking room breathing around her, and the two stopped clocks of her own careful heart, and she did not answer. But she took her grandmother's fragile hand and held it, and for a long time the only sound in the house was the patient chorus of all those mended machines, keeping the time that no one is ever given enough of, and neither of them knew, in that gentle and unguarded hour, that far across the city, the quiet days were already ending, and that the world was about to remember exactly where it had left its teeth. For 3 days it almost seemed as though the world might let them be, and then the world remembered its teeth. For Ray Petrocelli did not wait out the last week of the loan as any ordinary lender would have done. Instead, the storefront on the Hard Street sent Cora a new letter that arrived by hand rather than by post. A letter that moved the final date forward and demanded the impossible payment sooner. And 2 men in good coats who smiled too much came into Whitlock Clockworks on a quiet afternoon and walked slowly around the shop, touching the cases of the clocks and admiring the fine old building, and asking Cora in the most courteous voices imaginable whether she had given any thought to how sad it would be for a woman and her grandmother to lose such a lovely place. And they left without threatening a single thing out loud, which was precisely what made Cora's hands go cold. And that same week, Dottie Alvarez mentioned in passing that a car she did not recognize had been sitting across from the row houses for 3 nights, running with 2 men inside who never got out, and Cora, standing in her dark shop with the accelerated notice in her fist, and felt the whole shape of her life shift horribly beneath her. Because a small-time lender squeezing a desperate borrower did not send well-dressed men to admire the architecture and did not park watchers outside an old woman's window. And slowly, sickeningly, she began to understand that her private debt, the shameful secret she had carried alone for 2 years, had somehow stopped being about money at all, and had become a lever, a thing that powerful people were using to pry at something much larger than her little shop. And though she could not yet see the whole of it, she felt the truth of it in her bones, that she had become useful to someone as a way of reaching someone else. And what neither Cora nor even the men in the good coats knew was how small and how human the thing had been that set it all in motion. For the answer did not lie in any clever plot, but in a single wounded evening, some days earlier, when Gia Ferraro, sitting at a long dinner among the polished people of the antiques trade, had let 3 years of buried hurt loosen her tongue over a glass of wine, and had said, to a well-connected dealer she had known for years, with a bitter little laugh meant to sound like nothing at all, that she had heard the strangest thing lately, that the great Lorenzo Barone, who had once walked out on his own wedding without so much as an explanation, had suddenly turned up in person to beg a place for some unknown girl who fixed clocks in Pawtucket, and she had said it only to wound the memory of a man who had wounded her, never dreaming it would travel. But the dealer she said it to did business at the edges of the Falcone family's world, and a careless sentence spoken out of jealousy at a dinner table passed from one ear to another the way such sentences always do, until it reached men who had spent years searching in vain for a single soft place in Lorenzo Barone's armor, and who could hardly believe their fortune when they realized that the girl who fixed clocks and the girl whose family deed had been sitting in their laundry for 2 years were one and the same. And so it was not treachery or espionage that had turned Cora Whitlock into a weapon. It was one bruised heart, speaking one unguarded sentence, an ordinary and entirely human mistake, and that was somehow the most frightening thing of all. Cora might never have pieced the rest of it together on her own had she not gone looking, but fear made her sharp, and in the days that followed she began to notice things she was not meant to notice. A quiet man who was always somehow near the corner when she walked her grandmother to the market. Another who sat in a parked car outside the shop long after the strangers Dottie had described should have grown bored, and at first she took them for more of the Falcones' watchers, until the night she saw one of them nod with unmistakable respect to a black car that slowed as it passed, and something about the choreography of it was wrong, was protective rather than predatory. And when she confronted the man directly on the cold sidewalk, he would not lie to her cleanly enough, and piece by piece she dragged it out of him, that these men were not Falcones at all but Barones, that Lorenzo had quietly posted a watch around her grandmother's home, and worse, far worse to her mind, that he had already sent word to Coastline Financial that he would settle the matter of the deed himself, that he had reached out to the very men who held her family's life in their hands, and offered to buy her debt out from under her, without asking her a single question, or speaking to her a single word. And Cora stood on that freezing sidewalk, and felt something break in her, that was not fear, and was not gratitude, but was older and more essential than both. Because she had built her entire life, brick by painful brick, around one unbreakable rule, that she would only ever accept what she had earned with her own 2 hands, that her poverty had taken her comfort, and her father, and very nearly her hope, but had never once taken her right to look any person in the eye, as an equal who owed them nothing. And now a man with more money than God had reached into the most private ruin of her life and begun quietly rearranging it like a piece on a board, and she drove herself half mad through a sleepless night before she went to find him, and when she did not weep, and she did not thank him. She faced him in the cold with her chin up, and her voice shaking with a fury that came from the deepest part of her. And she told him that she was not one of his broken clocks to be carried home, and mended and set back on a shelf, that she had not asked him to dig through her shame, and she had not asked him to buy her, that she would rather lose the shop and the building, and her father's last unfinished clock, and stand in the street with her grandmother, than be purchased by a powerful man, and have him call that purchase affection. And Lorenzo tried to tell her that she did not understand what she was standing in the middle of, that the people who held her debt were not lenders but wolves, and that they were using her to get to him. But every word he said only proved her point in her own ears, that she was a piece in a game between 2 kings. And she cut him off, and told him that whatever war he was fighting, she wanted no part of it, and no part of him, that he was to call off his men, and stay away from her grandmother, and stay away from her, and then with hands that would not quite hold steady, she took out her phone, and blocked his number in front of him, so that he would understand she meant it, and she turned and walked away into the dark, and did not look back. And Lorenzo Barone, who could have had almost anything in the city by lifting one finger, stood alone on the pavement, and let her go, because for the first time in his life, he had met a person whose respect could not be bought at any price, and losing it hurt worse than any wound he had ever taken. He did not sleep that night either, and by morning something in Lorenzo had changed, because in the whole of his life, every problem he had ever faced had yielded to the same two tools: money and force, and Cora Whitlock had just shown him with perfect clarity that the one thing he wanted most in the world would be destroyed by both, that to pay her debt was to prove her right that he had bought her, and that to send men against the Falcones on her behalf was to drag her deeper into the very darkness she was trying to climb out of. And so the hardest man in Providence sat with the humbling truth that if he truly wished to protect this woman, he would have to learn, at 34 years of age, an entirely new way to love someone, which was to shield her without owning her, and to help her without ever letting the help take her dignity. And once he understood that, the path became clear, for he would not touch the honest part of her debt at all. He would leave the true principal she had borrowed for her father exactly where it stood so that she could pay it in her own time, with her own hands, and owe no living soul her freedom. And he would spend his own power only on the thing that was his world's poison, and not hers. The criminal machinery that had turned an ordinary loan into a blade. And so Lorenzo Barone did what he did better than any man alive. He gathered information, quietly and patiently and without a single raised voice, calling in years of favors and old debts, until Tommy Greco had assembled a thick and damning record of exactly what Coastline Financial truly was. The layered accounts and the fictitious borrowers and the long laundered river of Falcone money that ran beneath the respectable storefront, every illegal loan and falsified ledger, documented in a way that could not be argued with. And then Lorenzo requested, through the old and careful channels that such men used, a private sit-down with Salvatore Falcone himself. And he went to it alone and unarmed, as the custom demanded, and he did not shout, and he did not threaten. He simply set a single folder on the table between them, and let the old enemy of his family turn its pages in silence. And when Salvatore looked up, Lorenzo told him in a voice as level as a still pond that the contents of that folder existed in several copies, held by several people, and that if anything at all should trouble a certain clockmaker in Pawtucket, or the old woman who lived above her shop, if a single watcher remained outside that door, or a single dollar of that ruinous interest was ever collected, then those copies would find their way into the hands of the federal authorities, and, worse for the Falcones, into the hands of their own partners and creditors who would not take kindly to learning how carelessly their money had been handled. And Salvatore Falcone, who had spent a long life weighing exactly this kind of arithmetic, understood at once that the clockmaker was worth a great deal less to him than the machine Lorenzo now held over his head, and so the arrangement was made without another word needing to be said. The deed to the little shop and the home above it was to be returned in full and clean, and the murderous interest was to be struck away entirely, leaving only the plain and honest sum that Cora herself had originally borrowed. And within days the consequences moved through the shadows, the way such consequences do. Quiet and total, and never spoken of aloud, for Ray Petrocelli, who had drawn far too much attention to a channel that was supposed to be invisible, and had let a lever slip that was never meant to be seen, found himself cast out by the very family he had served, his storefront shuttered, and his usefulness at an end, and the Falcones quietly lost a laundry that had earned them well for years. And not one blow was ever struck where anyone could see it. And Lorenzo Barone walked away from the table having spent everything he was to buy a stranger her freedom, and having arranged it all so carefully that she would never even know she had been in danger, and never guess that the man she had blocked and banished had been the one to lift the knife from her throat. The first true light came, as it so often does, from the very door Cora had broken open herself, for the astronomical clock she had brought back to life through 3 sleepless nights could not be kept a secret in a world as small and as proud as the trade of mending old things. And when the museum's curators came to collect the piece they had already mourned as lost, and found it instead breathing and turning and keeping the slow time of the heavens once more, the story of who had done the impossible after the masters had surrendered traveled far faster than any word from Lorenzo Barone ever could have. And Gia Ferraro, cornered now by the one thing she valued even above her old wound, which was the honor of her craft, and the name of her house, could no longer pretend that the girl from Pawtucket was anything less than the finest ear she had ever encountered, and so it was Gia herself who came, stiff and unwilling and honest, to offer Cora a proper contract. A rich commission to restore a whole collection of clocks and automata that a museum had entrusted to the atelier, work that would carry Cora's own name beside the atelier's, and pay her more than she had earned in the 2 hardest years of her life, and Cora accepted it, not as charity, and not through any man's shadow, but as a thing she had wrenched out of the world with her own hands. And with the very first payment of that honest work she did the thing she had dreamed of doing for 2 years. She walked into what remained of the office that had once been Coastline Financial, and paid off the plain and honest sum she had first borrowed to save her father. Every dollar of the true principal settled with money she had earned, and she walked out owing no living soul her freedom. The deed to Whitlock Clockworks clean and whole in her own name at last, though she did not yet understand why the crushing interest that should have buried her had simply and quietly vanished from the ledger, or why the men in the good coats had melted away like frost in the sun. And it was that unanswered question that finally brought her back to Gia. Because something did not add up, and Cora had spent her whole life refusing to look away from things that did not add up, and the 2 women sat together in the golden warehouse among the beautiful broken things, and this time there was no ice in it, and Gia, who had watched this girl do what her own masters could not, and had felt her old bitterness curdle into something like shame, told her the truth at last, all of it, that a leverage of that kind did not simply disappear on its own, and that only one man in the city had both the reason and the power to make it disappear so completely, and so silently. And then Gia confessed the harder thing, that she had been the one, in a single careless and wounded moment at a dinner table, to let slip the words that had painted the target on Cora's back, that her own 3-year-old bitterness had spoken one jealous sentence and set the whole dark machinery turning, and she said she would carry that for a long time. And then, because honesty once begun has its own momentum, Gia told Cora the thing she herself had only lately come to understand. That the reason Lorenzo Barone had walked out of their engagement 3 years ago without an explanation had never been the coldness she had spent all this time hating him for, that a war had been rising in the shadows that season, and he had ended it and pushed her out of his life precisely so that no enemy would ever think to use her against him the way they had just tried to use Cora. That he had let her believe he was heartless because it was safer for her to hate a villain than to love a target, and Cora sat very still as the whole shape of the man she had banished rearranged itself before her, understood at last that he had not bought her and had never once meant to, that he had in fact deliberately refused to pay the honest part of her debt precisely so that she could pay it herself and keep her dignity whole, that he had spent everything he was to lift the danger from her, while arranging it all so carefully that she would never even know she had been in danger, taking no credit, asking for nothing, letting her go on believing the worst of him, rather than rob her of the one victory that had to be hers alone. And Cora Whitlock, who had accused this man to his face of trying to purchase her life, and had blocked his number in front of him to be sure he understood, felt the ground of her own certainty give way beneath her, and she understood with a slow and painful clarity exactly how deeply and how unfairly she had misjudged the only person besides her father who had ever truly seen what her hands could do. She did not sleep on it, and she did not wait, because she had learned from her grandmother that the doors that matter are the ones you walk through yourself, and so the next evening she took the small mantel clock of dark wood and tarnished silver, mended now and cleaned and whole again, and she carried it across the city to Federal Hill, to the quiet rooms above the shuttered club, where the hardest man in Providence lived alone, with the echoes of everything he had lost, and when he opened the door and found her standing there, he went as still as she had ever seen him, and she did not offer any speech she had prepared. She simply came in and set his mother's clock down on the table between them, the the way he had once said it on her bench, and she asked him the same small and ordinary question she had asked that first night. Whether he wanted her to leave the hands frozen at the hour it had stopped, a memorial to the minute the world had taken Serafina from him, or whether he wanted her to set it right and let it run. And Lorenzo looked at the little clock that held the last minute of his mother's life, and then at the woman who had somehow understood without being told what that minute meant to him, and for the second time in his adult life, and the first time in front of another living soul, he felt his careful armor simply fail him, felt his eyes burn and his throat close. And he did not fight it, and he did not turn away to hide it. And after a long moment, he said in a voice barely above a whisper that she should let it run, and Cora reached out and set the hands true, and wound the mainspring gently, and gave the small heart the lightest push, and the clock that had been silent for 22 years began softly to tick in the still room, marking not the moment of a death any longer but the ordinary living seconds of an ordinary evening, and something in Lorenzo that had been frozen just as long began, terribly and quietly, to move again, and he told her then the thing he had never told her, that when her letter had fallen from her coat that night on the train, he could have handed it back unread in a single heartbeat, and had fully meant to. But that the first line had caught him and held him because in it he had seen his own buried self staring back at him, and that everything he had done since had come from that recognition, and from nothing baser, and Cora said that she was sorry, truly sorry, for standing in the cold and calling him a man who bought people, and Lorenzo shook his head slowly and told her that she had been right to guard herself, that in his whole life almost everyone who had ever come close to him had wanted something, and that the very suspicion she had thrown at him, the fierce refusal to be bought or handled or saved, was the exact thing that had made him trust her when he had learned to trust no one, because a person who could not be purchased was the rarest and most precious thing his world had ever shown him. And they stood there on either side of a clock that was learning how to run again, two people who had each locked their own hearts at the precise minute they had lost the parent they loved, and had carried the stopped machine of themselves through all the years since, and in the soft new ticking of that little clock, they each felt something they had long believed was gone from them forever begin. Very carefully, to keep time once more, and when at last his hand found hers across the small table, neither of them pulled away, and nothing more needed to be said. And the quiet in the room was no longer the quiet of grief, but the quiet of two survivors who had finally, against all the odds their lives had given them, come home. Several months later, the little corner of Pawtucket where the old mills stood looked much as it always had, except that the windows of Whitlock Clockworks glowed warm and full of light well into the evenings now, and beneath the hand-lettered sign her father had painted there hung a small new plaque that read, "Restored by Whitlock in partnership with Ferraro Atelier," a line of quiet words that told anyone who understood the trade that the woman inside was standing squarely on her own 2 feet and on the strength of her own gift, not on any man's money, and not in any man's shadow, for Cora had paid her own debt, and earned her own name, and taken the commissions that came to her now, on the merit of the impossible things her hands could do. And the shop that had so nearly gone dark was more alive than it had been since her father was well, the crooked chorus of 100 mended clocks filling the rooms with their patient and uneven music, and in the back parlor by the fire sat Eleanor Whitlock, 79, and grown a little frailer through the winter, but easy now, in a way she had not been in years, listening to the steady ticking of a whole room of machines her granddaughter had brought back from the edge of silence, knowing at last and without a shadow of doubt that the girl would be all right, that whatever came, Cora had proven she could keep any promise she set her heart to, and above the mantel of that fire, set side by side in 2 simple frames, were 2 small worn pieces of paper that no visitor would ever guess the meaning of, one a memorial card printed with the name of a woman named Serafina, its back covered in the cramped hand of a grieving boy who had once listed 10 reasons to keep breathing until morning, and beside it a folded page in a trembling hand that gave 12 reasons for a defeated woman not to give up, Two quiet manifestos written years and miles apart, by two people who had each touched the very bottom of things and had refused, against everything, to stay there. And at the table that evening Lorenzo Barone sat down to a plain and simple supper of Dottie Alvarez's lentil soup, between Cora and her grandmother, with no guards standing at the door, and no armor of any kind about him. Only a man learning slowly what it felt like to belong somewhere, and if you had looked closely at that mantle you would have seen the last small wonder of it, that his mother's mended clock and the little clock Cora kept for her father now ticked side by side upon the same shelf, and had somehow, over the quiet weeks, come to strike the very same hour at the very same moment. Two hearts of brass that had each stopped at a loss and had each been taught to beat again. And perhaps that is the truest thing this whole story has to leave with you, that there are some doors in this life that no one can open for you, that you must find the courage to break down with your own hands, and that a person's dignity is the one thing in this world that was never meant to be bought at any price. And that sometimes the very person who reaches into the dark to pull you out is the person who most needs you to reach back and pull them out of a darkness of their own. Because no night is ever so black, and no heart is ever so long stopped, that it cannot, with a little patience and a little love, be brought to beat its first new beat again. And if this story touched something in you tonight, if it warmed a corner of your heart the way that little shop full of ticking warmed the cold off the bay, then please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, and to like and share this video, so that we can keep bringing you stories like this one every single day, and we would truly love to hear from you. So tell us in the comments how this story made you feel, and what part of it stayed with you, because it means more than you know to read the honest feelings that come straight from your hearts. And from all of us to all of you watching tonight, we wish you good health and a life full of quiet joy and peace in every ordinary day. So thank you for listening, goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next story.